Okay, apparently take 5. Anyways, we are going to be talking today about George Stinney Jr. or George Junius Stinney Jr. Little boy, and I want to tell you, I feel horrible for both sides. Okay, I feel horrible for the girl's parents. I feel horrible for his family. So I seem biased anyway. I'm not. Like, it's a horrible situation altogether. But this is not just completely about their murder. This is about his execution. I say murder as well. So this is a video about him. And there's really not a whole lot about them either. Not a whole lot about this whole case anyway. I mean, it's gonna be a long video, but some pictures and stuff and their background, there's really not a whole lot. Anyway, George Jr. was born October 21st, 1929 in Pinewood, South Carolina, here in the United States, to George Junius Sr. and Amy Brown Stinney. At the time of his passing, he had 2 siblings, Charles Stinney, who was 12, which I believe they called John, I'm wondering if that's his middle name, and Catherine Stinney, which they called Emma, which I believe is her middle name. She was 10. In 1944, the year this family's life, all the family's life, changed forever. Little George Jr. stood just 5'1". Picture this. I'm going to put a picture for us. 5'1" and weighed just 90 to 95 pounds. He was just a little kid. He was just 14 years old. That's pretty small for a 14-year-old. So, like, imagine that. He lived in Alculu, South Carolina. They called this little town their home. Their town. Like, it's itty bitty. It's not very. It's an incorporated family. Incorporated town now. They describe it as a small home with a chicken coop and company housing. So I'm guessing it was a housing unit owned by the sawmill his father worked in. George Sr. worked at the sawmill in town. At the time, this small town was seen as a working class mill town. So everything pretty much went around the sawmill. Rural white and black neighborhoods were segregated, like so many southern towns were at the time. And it was separated by the train track. As you know, like, you hear the whole alley thing, but it was separated by a train track, so African Americans lived on one side of the train tracks and white folks lived on the other, as well as segregated schools and churches with for white and black residents, which made it so they didn't interact very much, which I'm sure made the white people very happy. On March 23rd in 1944, literally, what is it today? Yesterday, which I did not plan when I made this video to put this out on the time period of it, the actual incident, but as I was researching it last night, I was like, wow, this is really close. The bodies of June Binnicker, she was just 11 years old, and Mary Emma Damas, and she was just 8 years old. These little girls were found in a ditch on the African American side of the track after the girls had not come home the night before. Stinney Jr., the father of George, helped even look for the little girls, which I want to know. I bet you the white folks wouldn't have helped him search for George if he was missing. The little girls had been beaten with a weapon. Some guessed either a piece of blunt metal or a railroad spike, causing blunt force trauma so severe it literally penetrated their skulls. And there's several injuries. I'll put just the medical examiner's picture. Well, not picture, but a picture of what the medical examiner said. The medical examiner stated that the wounds had been, quote, inflicted by a blunt instrument with a round head about the size of a hammer, end of quote. He also stated there was no evidence of sexual assault or SA to Mary, but there was slight bruising to Betty's genitals, and there's also swelling to her, but they both still had their hymens intact. The girls were last seen riding their bikes, picking flowers. They stopped by at the Stinney home to ask George Jr. and Amy, his sister, if they knew where they could find marigolds, a local name for passion flowers. Amy said she was with George Jr. at the time the girls killed. So at the time that they estimated the death, he had an alibi. He was with his sister. According to an article by Wire Service on March 24th, 1944, that the sheriff had reported the arrest of George Junius and that the boy had reportedly confessed and led to a hidden piece of iron. And I'm guessing it was probably a railroad spike, like they say, because this is a round end of the spike. So I'm guessing it was probably a railroad spike like this. So that it should could have been. George and his older half-brother John were both arrested on the suspicion of killing the little girls. John was let go, but George Jr. was kept in custody. This poor little boy was only able to see his parents after the trial and after conviction. His arresting officer, H.S. Clarendon County Deputy, in a handwritten statement wrote, "I arrested a boy by the name of George Stinney. He then made a confession and told me where to find a piece of iron about 15 inches. Think of how heavy this is as I describe it. Where he said he put it in the ditch about 6 feet from this bicycle. He said 15 inches of iron. That's pretty big. And on top of that, they'll say it here, but it was a width of his thumb. That is a pretty heavy. You got a 90-pound kid being able to swing that enough to crush 2 little girls' skulls. Yeah. Not only that, but his father was then fired after George Jr.'s arrest, and the whole family was made to immediately leave the home at the company housing. So now they're homeless. The family even was made to fear for their safety. They had lynch mobs wanting to kill the family even. George Jr. had no support during his 81 days in jail and even in trial. He was detained in a jail in Columbus, 50 miles or 80 kilometers or whatever, and weird people, from Uluku because of the risk of being lynched. This poor boy was not able to see his parents or have any support during his interrogation. They interrogated this 14-year-old boy. White officers interrogated this 14-year-old boy probably for hours without a lawyer or his parent. Even though the Sixth Amendment guarantees legal counsel, but this wasn't a routine in the court process till the United States Supreme Court's 1963 ruling, Gildian versus Wainwright, that made it a requirement to have a representative during criminal proceedings. The trial, if you can call it that, I had a longer one when I did jury duty with a drunk driver. Jury selection and everything took place on April 24th, 1944. His court-appointed lawyer was Charles Gordon, a tax commissioner that was campaigning for election for our local office, which was white. This worthless lawyer did not challenge the 3 cops who testified to George Jr.'s confession to the 2 murders. He didn't even try to defend poor George. He didn't challenge the state prosecution's presentation of 2 different versions of George Jr.'s supposed confession. As for his supposed confessions, the first version, George was attacked by the girls after he tried to help one girl who had fallen in the ditch, and he killed them in self-defense. Okay. Second version, he had followed the girls, first attacking Mary Emma and then Betty June. There is no actual written records of his supposed confession, only Deputy Newman's statement, a white cop. The prosecution called the 3 cops and 3 witnesses. Reverend Patton that found the girls' bodies, 2 doctors who did the autopsy. The court allowed the speculation and theory of rape due to the bruising on Betty's genitalia, but they, again, both still had their hymen, so there really was no rape. Patton, George's lawyer, did not call witnesses, did not cross-examine the witnesses, and offered very little to no defense. It lasted 2.5 hours. All of this, witnesses and everything, only lasted 2.5 hours. 1,000 plus white people crowded the courtroom, but no African Americans were allowed. Poor boy was 14 years old and tried for murder in front of an all Southern white jury. Less than 10 minutes it took those racist white folk found George Stinney Jr. guilty of murder in 10 minutes. It took longer for us to figure out whether the drunk driver was guilty. Judge Philip H. Stroll sentenced George to death at 14 years old by the electric chair. No transcript of this trial and no appeal ever filed. George's family, churches, and the NAACP appealed to Governor Owen D. Johnson for clemency due to his age. The pleas from the white folks came with affirmation of the KKK. Due to his age, others urged the governor to let the execution happen, of which his spineless governor did. The governor had the nerve to visit George Jr. at the death house 2 days before his execution on June 14th. The governor responded to one clemency appeal with, "I have just talked with the officer who made the arrest in his case," and all officers, especially white officers, talking to a black kid, totally reliable. "It may be interesting for you to know that Stinney killed the smaller girl to rape the larger one." And listen to this story because it made me really suspicious of the judge, actually. "He killed the larger girl and raped her dead body. 20 minutes later, he returned and attempted to rape her again, but her body was too cold. All of this he admitted himself." How did he come up with that story? It makes me really suspicious. Even though the evidence doesn't say any of this, I'd be worried about how this governor came up with such a sick story. Between the time George was arrested and his murder, his poor parents were allowed to just one last time see their boy alive because they were threatened to be lynched. It was supposedly reported that George confessed 3 times the week before his murder. One was less than an hour before his murder. All 3 were reported by contemporary news reports. 5 days before his murder, Dr. J. Baxter, a found member of the South Carolina Board of Pardons that visited all the inmates on death row, said that George initially denied committing the murders, but then said he was guilty and not sure why he killed them. Stinney had said the girls had asked him where he could find the flower, after which he told them they could find honeysuckles in the woods. Shortly after, he followed them and beat them to death, killing the younger girl first. Reported that Stinney said he used an iron rod about 12 inches and about as thick as his thumb. 2 days later, George was reported to have confessed again, this time to the penitentiary captain of the guard. He said he had killed the younger girl first and used a piece of iron, committing the murders. Thank goodness the execution of a 14-year-old was rare, but unfortunately not unheard of in the United States. Some sources said George Jr. was youngest in the 20th century, but not necessarily true. There are recorded executions of a 14-year-old in North Carolina in 1914 that was wrongly listed as 18. Another boy in South Carolina in 1921 who was wrongly listed at 16. Then another 14-year-old boy in Florida in 1910 who was listed as 15. And I will be doing more research on them, but they're probably all African American as well. His execution, or as I say, murder. George Stinney, age 14, was murdered on Friday, June 16, 1944, at 7:30 a.m. by electric chair, a chair made for full-grown adults. George Stinney was reported to have supposedly made his last confession 30 minutes before his death. The sheriff of Clarence County spoke to George Jr. and said George told him that he was guilty and acted alone. George's little body was restrained by his arms and legs and body to the chair. The officer asked little George if he had any last words, but he only shook his head. The executioner pulled a strap from the chair and put it over George's mouth. When the lethal electricity was applied, the mask covering his face fell off, showing that his eyes were wide open. It was reported by some that he sobbed at his execution. Who wouldn't? We're 14 years old. Who wouldn't sob? And then a stack of books was used to have him sit in the chair correctly. This was later contested by Terry Evans, the niece of Mary, the victim's mother, Lula May. Terry's uncle, Clyde Barnes, watched the execution, told Evans' father that he witnessed it was just a rumor that the hood slipped, and they did not put a stack of books under him. But it would make sense if they did. I don't believe anything these white people say. George Jr. was buried in an unmarked grave at the Calvary Baptist Church Cemetery in Lee County, South Carolina. Now we're going to modern day. Case was reopened. George Frierson in 2004 is a local historian that grew up in Alcolu, started looking into the case after he read a newspaper article about it. His research gained Steve McKenzie and Matt David, South Carolina lawyer, as well as Ray Brown and attorney James Manning and others, put in hundreds of hours researching and reviewing historical documents they found, witnesses and evidence to help exonerate George Jr. Among those people who helped in the case was the JRJ, the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, that filed a brief with the court in 2014. Pearson and the lawyers working pro bono at first were looking for relief through the Pardon and Parole Board of South Carolina. McKinsey and Burgess, with attorney Ray Chandler, representing the Stinney family, filed a new trial motion on October 25th, 2013, which I found very interesting because his birthday was October 21st, so it was so close to his birthday. What would have been his birthday. Pearson said in interviews that there has been a person that has been named as being the culprit who is now deceased, and it was said by the family that there was a deathbed confession and that there were more remorse. The rumored culprit came from a prominent white family. A member or members of that family had served on the initial coroner's quest jury that had recommended that George Jr. be prosecuted. January 2014, new evidence in the court hearing that included testimony by George's siblings that he had been with them at the time of the murders, as well as was introduced from the Reverend Francis, who found the girls and pulled them from the water-filled ditch. In his statement, he remembered there was not much blood in or around the ditch, suggestion that they may have been killed elsewhere and moved. The Johnny Hunter was in prison with George testified that the teenager told him that he had been made to confess and that had always maintained his innocence. December 16th, 2014, instead of approving a whole new jury trial, Circuit Court Judge Carmen Mullen vindicated George Jr.'s conviction. She ruled that he had not received a fair trial as he was not effectively defended and his Sixth Amendment rights had been violated, which was law at that time, but there's not, of course, especially for African Americans, followed. The judge's ruling was a rare use of the legal of coram nobis,